Hello again. Welcome to Battery Day 2023, Session 2 on BESS Scale Up and Integration. For those who don't know, BESS stands for Battery Energy Stationary Storage. So it's the use of batteries outside of the EV industry as a store of energy, most often to support the grid. Now, we know that renewable electricity is intermittent in nature, and batteries are key to harnessing the intermittent nature of renewable electricity. So, in this session, you'll hear about the important role that BESS plays to help scale up, integrate, and optimize renewable energy distribution, reduce peak demand, and mitigate power outages. We have three experts that are going to be sharing their best knowledge with us today. Let me introduce them to you. First up, we have Patricia Dorez. She is the Managing Director at 350 Renewable since 2015 and a former member of the Board of Directors of the Chilean Renewable Energy and Storage Association, where she was Vice President. She has over 15 years international experience. From 2017 to 19, she was the country manager of DNV and responsible for projects in Chile and Argentina, Uruguay, Peru, and Colombia. From 2011 to 15, she worked as an energy analysis manager for mainstream renewable power, and she led as the technical lead for sort of solar projects worldwide and led a team of wind and solar analysts in Latin America. So really knows about that flow from the renewable energy production to sort of storage into batteries. Then we have Julia Heckman. She is a clean tech and development finance professional with over 10 years of experience in the energy sector. And she currently works as an associate industry specialist as part of the global energy team at the IFC, the private sector investment arm of the World Bank Group. There, she focuses on market and regulatory analysis for investment projects, including battery storage, and has a specific focus on sort of sub-Saharan Africa. And then lastly, we have Ignacio, who is an energy and sustainability executive with deep technical background. His career spans 4 continents and several technologies with a predominance of wind and storage, in which he's led product management, product delivery, and business development and services operations. He finds fun in learning and teaching and in developing practical solutions rooted in technology development. His original aim was to foster for renewables, and now that they are generally accessible, he's focusing on facilitating a deeper penetration into the grid, sometimes this is with huge projects to gain on efficiency and scale, and sometimes it's in developing microgrids for environmentally sensible communities. So a real focus on people, product, and planet. Thank you all for joining us today, panelists.
Hello, good morning or afternoon. How are you doing?
Hello, everyone.
Good morning. Thank you so much.
So we're currently in a bit of a declining moment for BESS with sort of huge growth forecasts in the near term. Ignacio, could you please share some insights on what is underpinning the forecasted BESS surge?
Yeah, for sure. And Julia, you are going to forgive me for not using slides from the IFC. Let's go to one of the most commonly used third-party consultancies or influencers, however we want to call them, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and their figures are very similar to other analysts out there, S&P Global or any others, right? This is what we're seeing here. These are the projections. Where are we now? We are in 2023. Basically, we are about to hit the 50 gigawatt milestone. And I tend to speak more in terms of gigawatt than in gigawatt hours. As we look at the very common goals that everybody seems to be setting for 2030, more than for 2050, see, what do we have just in front of us, right? So we're going from 50 to 400 gigawatt, 7 years. That very easy math, 50 gigawatt per year. Meaning every year we need to do as much as we have done already. And here we focus on batteries, but batteries on their own only can walk a little bit. Then we need inverters, we need balance of plant, we need copper for the cabling, we need substations, you name it. It's the whole thing in terms of grid storage. But why is this? I think that's the question, right? And I think it's because we are finally getting to something that many of us already dreamed for many years, which is the energy trifecta. We always spoke about energy in terms of affordability, environmental consciousness, and security of supply, right? And we see how those play even on a geopolitical level. Now, batteries can help in all of those. So, as we had a big opportunity to do something really impactful in a very sustainable manner with a nascent industry now, we also need to look at what are the value drivers and what is the use cases. As we look into wind, solar, even geothermal and other renewables, we see that most of them have been thought of as generation assets. But when we look at BESS, battery energy stationary storage, we see that this is used as support for generation, for integration of those in renewables, but it can also and is actually being used in terms of transmission, but also downstream in terms of distribution. And if you go one step beyond that, many people are using them for trading, right? So it kind of hits the jackpot. This technology is valid for so many purposes, so many things that there's a huge interest. And this graph is very interesting because you see that it's all over the world, and there are good reasons for that because it impacts all of us in terms of the electricity aspects of energy. And electricity is driven, can I say, by governments and institutions in certain ways. Of course, customer behavior has a big impact about how we buy it and etc. Right? But this is not left to the vagaries of us as final users of transportation. This is very determined. We have common societal goals to go for this. So Bianca, I don't want to spend much more. We could be talking about this for hours, but basically this is hitting all the things that many years, when maybe 40, 50 years, 60 years ago, we were starting wind, okay, maybe 45 years, let's say. Solar, give it 20, 25 years. This BESS is being developed in maybe 15, and the pickup is tremendous.
Very quickly, for sure. And in this graph, we see the world split up into sort of three key regions: EMEA, APAC, and the Americas. Do BESS trends differ between these regions? And if so, how? Open to any of the panelists.
Let me start it off because now I already warmed my voice. So I think we see the same trends. If you look at the chart for any of those years, it's about the 30, 30, 30. It's split almost evenly. There are differences, obviously. North America, the US and Canada, they are pumped up by the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a regulatory program, if we can call it that. It's kind of a big stimulus package. In Europe, we are trying to do something similar, but as we see, it's very much more fragmented. So we come with all the cultural issues, language barriers, different market regulations, which market regulations also are different in pockets or sections in the US, but in the case of Europe is much more clear, right? And then Asia driven by mostly China, also India. China's a big powerhouse, and India trying to get there on hardware and very much on software and knowledge. So yeah, those would be my comments.
Maybe I can piggyback on that as well from the perspective of a development finance institution where we look at markets, of course, in terms of OECD markets and then emerging markets. So emerging markets being the markets in which we are actually active. And here we see certainly that there's a lot of drive in all regions, but emerging markets still lag behind quite a bit. And one of the big factors, of course, is also that influences where storage can really pick up is regulation. The question is, are you allowed to bring storage onto the grid? Are you able to remunerate the asset in a way that makes a project actually sensible. And so, yeah, we see certain markets really taking off and others not so. And unfortunately, regulation is really, and the market environment is a big, big aspect in this.
I just want to add, if I may, the the trends are definitely global, as in we are seeing a major tendency for electrification, and the easiest way of electrify is to get more renewables, and the cheapest renewables, whether we like it or not, are variable renewables, which are wind and solar PV. And what that means is that we need to find new ways of operating our transmission and our electrical systems. And our electrical systems, obviously, the more percentage of renewables that are variable that we have, require more and more flexibility. And this is not just a problem of renewables, because fossil fuels also are not these super flexible new technologies. They're not electronic. They're not. They do also have some inertia, and they're not super flexible. And what it means is that as we want to electrify our consumption, as we get more renewables that are variable into the grid, and as we need to operate these grids differently, storage, and in particular BESS, plays a key part. Not just because, yes, we are going to electrify our transport and we need electric vehicles, but because the actual electricity system needs to be managed in a different way, and because transmission is a super scarce resource. Transmission is across the globe something that is lagging behind the development of renewables, and something that is creating a lot of problems in terms of keeping up with the generation projects that we have. And building a transmission line is a massive, massive problem, because especially in developing countries, that often means many, many kilometers of line. That often means huge investment. And that often means that communities are not happy, and that you need to actually, even in some places, expropriate land to actually make a massive power line go through. And the role of storage there is key, because it means it can be used to actually reduce, or at least slow down, the rate at which we need this transmission, and alleviate some problems straight away, because it's modular, because it's fast, because it doesn't have a visual impact, because it doesn't require land expropriation, because of many things. So it means that we can actually use in a better way the infrastructure that we have, while we wait for those transmission upgrades to be available.
Absolutely. And I think, that's a great start for the audience to understand why BESS is forecast to grow so rapidly and why it's so important to the energy transition. And one of the reasons we have a BESS focused panel is not only because of that, but also to separate it out from all the EV talk that goes on. BESS is competing with EVs for this same battery supply from the battery value chain. Can any of the panelists share a little bit about this dynamic?
Well, sure. EV and BESS can be seen as competitors of sorts in terms of availability of the core resource, being the batteries, right? But also in terms of the power electronics that are needed to have them actually run or stay in the case of BESS. So I think it's a case of competition. We cooperate, but also we compete. So there are going to be companies that give services like data services, analytical services to both parts. The difference I see is, while EVs are more focused on the final user in terms of, I may drive an EV car, or a delivery company may be running vans based on the EVs, or trucks can be EV batterized of sorts. The push for BESS in the grid is mostly a big undertaking, which leads to smaller groups doing it. It means bigger companies, which are either utilities or independent power producers, IPPs. This does not preclude the fact that we could, in our houses as well, use BESS. That's a smaller BESS, that's a domestic BESS. But the main thing up to now in terms of bringing down the costs are going to be the very big investments. The very big investments are the ones that give clarity to the marketplace, that underpin all these gigafactories that we see for batteries, but also the big expansion into the power electronics area. our electronics companies are going to be much less incentivized by saying a promise of a market or final users in our houses, because that may come or that may go very easily, for example, with the interest rates, right? So the way I see it is there is the public space going for a social common goal, which is more handled by big institutions and utilities and IPPs. And then there is that same common goal with maybe incentives, but in which the private consumer, as ourselves, need to be involved. And I see that as a main difference.
Anybody else want to comment on the race against batteries for EVs?
I'm happy to just briefly chime in. Yeah, as Ignacio already said, a lot of the lithium-ion batteries are simply being soaked up by the EV industry. And thankfully also, this is of course creating the supply chains and bringing down the cost curve and all of that. But for the foreseeable future in this decade, within the energy storage industry, we will also continue to use lithium-ion batteries, no doubt about it. But these batteries, in large, are being designed for the automotive industry, and the electricity industry does have other requirements. So in a way, we're not bound to the to focusing as much on high density, low weight, which also opens up the sector in the future to to alternative technologies. And so in a way, while today 90% of BESS is still lithium ion, we could maybe hope that in the future, some of the other technologies will also take off in this space, and then ease the supply shortage in a way, or give more access to storage overall.
Absolutely. And
I want to give to. Sorry. Go, Bianca. Go. It's okay. You go first, Leon.
I was going to move on to the next question and ask.
Actually, then I want to add two things. I want to add, I think, an opportunity and a disadvantage, if you want. So in terms of, as Julia was saying, obviously it's very different, the market of EV and the market of BESS. And for that reason, I see an opportunity, and I am already seeing that deployed in there's some companies, for example, in Spain, that are already making really good use of second life batteries. And why is that? Because for a BESS system, it's not so important to have this energy density. It's not so important to have the range. You know, in the end, the batteries are going to be in a container on the ground, and those are huge advantages that make BESS a very interesting market for example, second life batteries. And electric vehicles cannot do that so easily. But I do want to make the point, and I think that's a really key thing to be clear, that because the electric vehicle market is 90% of the market and the batteries in BESS is probably about 10% of the market, well, what that means is that there's going to be a big lithium gap. And a lot of the quotations that get provided now by manufacturers are linked to the price of lithium. So we have seen, for example, this year's variations in the order of 30% or so. And that makes business cases and sometimes financing quite challenging. And going into the future, knowing about this lithium gap, let's call it that way, it's going to mean that the business cases and the regulations, just like Julia was saying earlier, are key to be able to finance these projects, because they need to be very clear on revenue and how to stack these revenues.
Absolutely, and we're going to go a little bit more into finance later. But before we do, I wanted to deep dive a little bit more into some of the other challenges that the BESS industry faces. So, for instance, how do challenges differ, say, when you're trying to deliver a BESS solution for large grids, servicing large populations versus, say, microgrids or island solutions?
Okay, that touches about where do we sell the BESS systems, right? Since I work for one of those companies. There is always going to be this topic about, in the case of the lithium-based batteries, the thermal runaway and the fire safety considerations and et cetera, right? So that is going to be a very important factor about how close to the populations you place the systems, what kind of systems and what kind of redundancies you use. And then that applies to the very big systems, of course, but also to the small systems. But you could say even more accurate on the big systems. So you can be close to a big city, but you need to be making sure you have all sorts of redundancies and etc. Or you can put them into the wide open in a weak node on the electrical grid, and then, okay, maybe emergency services are of a different kind and the impact is different, right? So all those things playing there into the big grids, big systems. When we go more into microgrid, of course, that's very relevant, but on top of that, you have the layer of the criticality for the system you're installing. So if you are going into an island, for example, and the island is, let's say, 40,000 people, and you have about a 30 megawatt grid, or 140,000 people and you have an 80 megawatt grid, sourcing BESS to those islands typically is a little bit complex. Then you go into the nitty gritty of the delivery of a project, like do you have the cranes for those systems that, as was referring here, tend to be a little bit on the heavier side, right? Just for practical matters. Are the ports prepared? Are those islands in communities where they have the regulations to deal with the health and safety and considerations, etc.? But especially that if you are going to hook up a system in there and you want to do it to maybe displace a fossil fuel plant that maybe is running as a standby unit in the background to support the main plant, then how you integrate that into the grid is critical, because if your BESS system doesn't work, then what are you doing? Or if it fails along the way, you are taking a needed redundancy in the system. So criticality of the use case into the microgrids, small islands, smaller communities, maybe remote places and so on, is much more important. And that also adds to the complexity of projects, and that, I would say, unfortunately, makes it typically a little bit more expensive, although I can tell you they tend to be much more fun projects.
Absolutely, and I can totally understand why the reliability in a microgrid would be so important. But you've touched on cost, and financing of BESS projects is a very interesting topic. I know, Julia, you have a lot of experience in this space. Could you talk a little bit about sort of BESS financing today and any headwinds that we face?
Sure. Yeah, so overall, there's a lot of drive from both development finance institutions like ours or private investors to invest in projects, but we're finding it's difficult to find bankable opportunities from a bank's perspective. So, and that is, of course, because BESS projects, as compared to solar or wind, are more complex. And also, so our issue very often is there's not enough of an operational track record for specific applications. So, and all of this leads to the fact that currently most BESS projects are actually financed on balance sheet, so, or by equity or quasi-equity. And what we're not seeing as much is access to senior debt. And that, of course, would make these projects cheaper. So diving in a bit more, so overall, renewable energy projects are really long-term projects. They're high CapEx, and hence we spread out the tenor of the loan over a long period, usually 15 to 20 years. And right now, the BESS projects on the grid have an age of around 12 to 13 years. So we don't really have the same operational data, and hence banks are not as comfortable financing these things. And on top of that, the life of a battery in this context is shorter than the life of the project. The project life is 15 years. So we need to have a good augmentation strategy and replacement strategy. And around all of that, other issues come up around, say, are the warranties sufficient to make it all work? And then the other aspect that is relevant in the financing of BESS is something that Patricia already mentioned, and that is revenue stacking. That in order to make projects commercially viable, often you have to find different sources of revenue. You might have a capacity payment or a payment for ancillary services, which also comes in regularly. And banks love regular cash flows. But then often to make the project actually work, you have to add in a bit more of price arbitraging. And this again just makes it more complex from a financing perspective. So let's leave it at that for now.
And
I just want to maybe touch on that, on business models and revenue stacking, right? And how dependent that is on the regulation. And going back to the first question we had, is like, how does this vary from region to region? I'm just going to put forward the example of Chile, which is trying to do at the moment a really big push for renewables and integrate. Well, it's done a really big push for renewables, but now having a really high percentage of their electricity from renewables needs to do a really big push for storage. So the first thing they've done is they have a tender specifically for storage in the country. That's going to happen in 2024. And what's really interesting is this is not storage on the basis of, a private company putting storage right next to a renewable energy project so that they don't waste the electricity if they do not have transmission, right? This is about creating essential infrastructure for the country. So they're using storage as a transmission asset. What they are actually putting out for tender is the equivalent of a transmission line, so essential country infrastructure. And that's a really key thing of being able to finance this, because we all know that transmissions gets easily financed. We all know that the consumer picks up the bill for that, and that there's a very clear business model on how to remunerate this. However, they're also trying to do storage as a way of not, let's say, waste renewable electricity if you have a particular project. So this is more a private project not wanting to waste their energy. And this is a business case that is really difficult. At the moment, most of the projects in Chile for that business model are corporate finance. They're not being financed by external investors. They're being financed by the companies themselves. And that's because they're taking a risk. So one of the things they're doing is trying to kind of play on the basis of the market. So the electricity prices are obviously cheaper during the day because we have a lot of solar PV. So there's an oversaturation of energy in the grid at those solar times. And yet at night, we have a lack of energy. And so the prices go up. So they're trying to kind of move the curve in a way to be able to make up for the difference in prices between day and night. But that's a real risky business, and it's not quite working out yet. Okay, that's, if you want to do it out of your corporate finance, out of your balance sheet, that's fine. But most banks will not buy into it unless you give them a bit more certainty.
Absolutely. And, while BESS activity is happening worldwide, Latin America does seem to have quite a few countries who are really pushing this technology. Could you share a bit more about some of these BESS hotspots?
So for me, the market that I see at the moment really doing the big push is Chile. And this is because they have a renewable energy tender next year, and they have this BESS tender also next year. They have at the moment about 64 megawatts of BESS installed, some of them since 2016 or earlier. So they've been pioneers in that respect. Since 2016, they have included in the regulation that BESS systems are able to inject. And this is not trivial, because BESS is not a generation technology. This is something completely different in the electrical system. So if you're a solar plant or a wind plant, you're definitely a generator. But if you're a BESS system, you're not a generator. You do not generate electricity. You just keep it and then inject it. So having in the regulation just a line to say that you are allowed to exist is already quite a pioneer thing. And they have that since 2016. And what they're doing now as well in their energy tender, they are specifically saying that the tender prices that you supply, they will give you an extra bit on top of it if you can generate 24/7. And that's basically to allow BESS offers to be put in, or renewables that are 24/7 to be able to compete, say, with solar PV or wind, which are more variable renewables. So those are really interesting ones. They're also changing the capacity factor, the capacity payment. So in electricity markets, you normally have an energy market where literally you just get
have a parallel capacity payments market where they pay you for your power as opposed to your energy, for your capacity, for being able to supply to the grid when the grid really needs that energy. And what they're trying to do is change the regulations so that you get more payments for storage, and they're taking it away actually from solar PV, so that it encourages solar developers to put storage. And the last thing they've done is try to allow participation in the ancillary services market. Although that's, I have to say that I think that's quite a bit behind, but they are working on it. So it's not quite there yet, but they're trying.
I think
go ahead.
I think what we have seen in renewables in general is, yes, Latin America has embarked on renewables because it makes full sense. Now, market considerations and most of the countries not being OECD, etc., has financial implications, as Julia, I think she referred to. You get to pay more for your money or for the money you borrow. And that has driven, with many other factors, Latin America to be a willingly adopter, but a later adopter. It's also fragmented in the sense of regulations and customs and imports and taxing and etc., which, if you take Latin America as a whole, we already saw in the map, North America is putting together, well, has passed the Inflation Reduction Act and etc. It's kind of siphoning many resources, even from Europe. So that competition for resources, but also for capital, etc., is a battle in which Latin America took its adoption of wind energy a little bit later than in general Far East Asia, North America, and Europe. And then I think something similar we are seeing in solar. So I don't have any doubts. Latin America is in there, and it has huge resources. The difference here is now it has huge resources in terms of lithium. So that could kind of shock the history of renewables adaptation or adoption in Latin America, but that will depend a lot on what is done on regulatory and country macro perspectives, I believe, because the resources are there, the need is there. Now, can they afford to use their own components of sorts? And can they develop an industry? And I think those are very big questions.
Totally.
So we're just going to shift over and move to answering some of the audience's questions, which have been rolling in. So my co-host Avrithi will come and share some of those questions.
Thanks, Bianca. We've got quite a few questions for this one, but one that came through earlier, which I thought was quite interesting. Vijay acknowledged the excellent points on transmission bottlenecks, but separately, the transmission and distribution losses are still quite significant, especially in developing countries. Do you see BESS investments reconfiguring transmission network formats?
Yes, absolutely. And I work for a private company, and we are doing transmission projects. And all the incentives, all the technical incentives are in there, but the market incentives typically are not in there. And the reason I say this is sometimes you have fully integrated utilities and then can more or less play with what they need. In some other markets, you have gone through liberalization of the sector, and you have separated generation assets from transmission assets, from distribution assets and trading. And what that has meant is that has put transmission companies into a legal framework of all you do is transmission. So if all you do is transmission, how can you take some energy and then revert it to yourself? That could be seen as not a nice practice. Like if you take it to the stream, cheating, because you're operating a grid, you are specifying the conditions into which generation assets can put energy to your grid. But if you are a part and a judge, that can be seen in a very difficult legal framework. And that's an inequation, because we haven't solved that even in the most complex and advanced markets in Europe or North America yet. We're still navigating through that.
I would just add that I think distribution is the big forgotten part of the energy transition, and it's going to have to change. It is changing. It used to be a really simple unilateral business where all the distribution companies had to do was take the energy from the transmission to their houses. And it is now there's a change of paradigm. This is a bilateral kind of business case. So like the consumers need to make better use of the electricity. They need to know that they should have cheaper electricity when there's a lot of solar PV generation. They do need to be encouraged to have batteries. So I do see distribution playing a much bigger role in the coming years, let's say, and that's going to change definitely how we are generating and consuming electricity.
Thanks, Patricia. Ignacio. We've got one more question around long duration storage. It's one question with many questions in it, but essentially, what actually constitutes long duration in BESS, and how important is it going to be? And then another question around lithium ion as a suitable technology for long duration storage.
Julia and I, we coincided in a work group specifically about this topic. So Julia, I already spoke a lot. Please go ahead first.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. So there's no official definition for what constitutes long duration energy storage in length. We talk about 10 hours, plus or minus, with the whole idea of actually being able to truly shift energy demand into the future, be it on a daily basis or be it on a monthly or even yearly basis at the end of the day. And there are technologies out there that can do this, but most of them are still very much in their infancy at the moment. And the question kind of went into the direction, well, how important is it? It is essential. It is really essential for, especially in many developing countries in which there simply is not the possibility to build out the type of grid that was built out in other more advanced countries. So having the possibility of actually storing electricity long term is essential. And we do have various like categories of technologies that do that. And of course, in the electrochemical area where lithium ion falls as well, but then also mechanical solutions like flywheels and such, and thermal solutions like storing energy in the form of heat in, say, in rock or in molten salt and things along those lines. So lithium ion is a part of it, but it's not the only technology that can actually deliver this in the long run.
Great, thanks, Julia. And I think it's time to present the results of our poll to hear from our panelists. So we asked the audience members, what are the most significant challenges currently hindering the widespread adoption of BESS in the energy sector? And these were the results that came up, the majority people voting for the cost of implementation. Panelists, what are your thoughts on these?
If I may add, I actually, like, of course, cost is a key thing, right? If you want to finance something, it has to compete with everything else that is available to provide that service. But I would say that regulation is the one thing that is stopping the implementation of BESS. Like, seriously, like if we had a carbon tax, it wouldn't be so cheap to generate with gas or coal or diesel. And that's a major, major stumbling block for some storage technology, for massive storage to be deployed. So I think having access to revenues depends on regulations. For me, I do agree that cost is a key thing, but I think actually above cost is regulation, always.
I absolutely second that.
I would say it depends. It depends what market we're looking at. We saw this is a worldwide effort, right, to be more sustainable in how we generate, transmit, and distribute energy, and in this case, electricity. So some markets are going to be seeing themselves in a better position to tackle costs. Some markets are better position in terms of public acceptance. Some markets, there is going to be a lot of NIMBY, not in my backyard effects. So maybe these are common trends, but we need to make sure we tackle what the different communities need. On a global scale, we know what we're aiming for in terms of renewables. But even with that, there's not 100% a belief into let's have renewables. There are pockets of resistance, but if we use BESS as a complement to renewables, we also have to use BESS as a complement for transmission, so that, as Patricia said, we don't need to build so many power lines. So that's related to renewables, but not so much. So I would say we need to go on a case-by-case scenario. It's more costly. It's a more thorough exercise. So we may be needing to look at the general trends, but also what happens at each market. As Julia was saying, underdeveloped markets in some senses, OECD versus non-OECD, etc. We need to be paying a lot of attention to the nuances.
Absolutely. And I think everybody can agree, like, BESS is so critical to the energy transition, and I think it needs a lot more spotlight on it. And thank you to each of our panelists for helping share the story of BESS, why it's important, and what are the challenges that we need to overcome to help this forecasted phenomenal growth of installation of BESS around the world. So now we're going to head over to wrap up this first section of Battery Day 2023, which was the Asia focus, before we're heading on over to Europe for the next set of panels and deep dives. So thank you very much to the panelists, and over to Simon and Clara.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bianca, and all those fantastic panelists. We're going to quickly wrap it up as well in a moment, kind of some of our, takeaways, learnings from this session, and of course, a bit of an outlook for the next one as well. But before we go to this, we actually want to do a big shout out to our gold sponsor, Dyson. If you have a phone with you, which probably many of us have, you might want to take a quick, snap of this QR code, have a quick, look up of this form which is behind it, because they have some really exciting developments on their end. Many of you might not be aware, but they're actually really ramping up in the battery field. If you ever used the Dyson device, you see maybe, you have maybe experienced the power of some of the batteries they're using, but they actually really want to ramp up their own developments quite a lot. You can also see it here in the background of some of the really exciting new facility they're building up, which means a lot of opportunities. That means in Singapore, but also abroad. Because there's a massive investment, and if you go into this QR code, you can just put your information there to kind of hear more about from them. You can also look at some of the roles they've opened, but there's many more also to come. And I think we're just really excited to have them with us. As a bit of a quick history, we actually have been working with them also in the past for another event like Battery Dev, and they've been very supportive there as well. And I've personally been quite blown away by their development in the battery field, because they're just doing a lot of really cool things, because they have a lot of batteries in the field. If you just think about all of the devices, maybe some of you have them or have seen them. There's a lot of batteries in the field. There's a lot of interesting data, a lot of really cool developments they're building. And again, they really want to ramp up their own. And it's the most significant investment in advanced manufacturing in Dyson's history. And maybe as a fun fact, this facility you're seeing here, they're building up, is the size of 53 basketball courts. So again, you might want to have a quick scan of this. And again, big thanks for Dyson to support this event and make this available for all of us, next to the other sponsors as well. Clara.
Great. Thanks, Simon. So we wanted to inform you about 2 dates for your diary. The first is a Women in Batteries event. So this event is open to all, male allies, non-female identifying people, women, anyone. And it is our second Women in Batteries event of the year. We're very excited about it. So we'll be running speed networking. We'll have a career success story from a woman in our network. And we're also looking to run a workshop as part of this event. So please register if you're interested. And then the next very important date for your diary is we're in a position to announce Battery Day 2024. Which is going to take place on the 26th of September next year. And there is a QR code here, which is a link to the event. So please register your interest and get involved. And of course, if you're interested in any sponsorship opportunities, your company is interested in sponsoring Battery Day next year, please get in touch with us. All right, so we're coming up to closing part 1, the Asia focus for Battery Day. You've heard from 2 excellent panels. Simon, do you want to give a little bit of a recap?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, of course, there's quite a lot which has been said. I think definitely something from the first panel on battery market overview in Asia. I think some really fascinating conversation also about nickel, which I think is really interesting with Indonesia and the developments there. Of course, anybody has been following it, quite a lot has happened in the past year. And as we're also using this event to kind of reflect a bit on the past year, I think this was very fitting. Another thing I really took also away was, the observations with the investments of China or from Chinese companies and also the government support for China and Korea, and really triggered by also the Inflation Reduction Act, right? This has been a big push also over the past year. We have seen as well for the US, but also interesting to really think about and observe what this has been meaning for Asia, especially for the investment from China, maybe, look into other areas they could invest in, but also Korea. So I think, a lot of the new investments in Europe from China, for example, but also a lot of investments from Korea, for example, in the US, but also, so it's just, I think, interesting to see how all of these things are quite well connected. Another thing, if you look at the second panel from BESS, stationary storage, of course, a big topic. We talk a lot about automotive and other sectors, but again, stationary being a very interesting point there as well. Again, talking about the impact from Inflation Reduction Act, but also seeing, some of the differences in different regions, how BESS is approached. I thought also quite interesting, we had this poll on LinkedIn, which showed, that a lot of people thought the cost is a really big block right now, the biggest blocker, biggest challenge there. And it was interesting actually hear from our panelists how they think maybe regulation actually is the biggest one. If you ever try to permit and get these BESS installed in some regions, you might be familiar with it as well. So I think just really interesting insights from esteemed panelists. And if you're curious about this and you want to watch them again, and maybe you're just listening in now and you missed some of the previous sessions, if you have a pro or VIP ticket, you probably know that you will get access to all of the recordings afterwards. But also if you now realize, I didn't get one of these tickets and I would like to watch the recording, you can again get your phone out, get this QR code here, and you can receive and purchase the recordings from this event, but also all of our previous events there as well. So in case you missed any of these interesting sessions. So what's happening next, Clara?
So I'm going to take you through what is coming up in part 2, which is the Europe Focus session of the day. We have a Europe keynote with Optel. We've got 2 more panel discussions, one on battery passports and one on battery supply chain, raw materials and sustainability. And then we have a choice of 3 deep dives for you in the session section. But now it's over to you to decide whether you'd like to network, including VIPs. There'll be a separate VIP networking session for you in the sessions section, or you can join the Battery MBA case study, and that's also in the sessions section. So I'll leave it over to you and see you shortly.